Hi, this is Dr. Kristen Ronier. I am a professor of philosophy at Athabasca University. I'm also the coordinator for Philosophy 252. This unit, Unit 3, really starts to dive into particular deductive forms of argumentation. And what I want to say right off the bat before I start getting into this overview is that the only way to really take in these kinds of concepts is through working through the exercises. So this is where you might want to start thinking about this along the lines of how you're studying, and studying for this like you would something in math. So really getting through all of the small steps will help you retain and be able to apply these concepts so you can notice them when they're being used. So validity is something really different than when we say, oh, that's valid, yeah, it's valid, that you feel that way or something like that, right? Where valid is just used as a word to mean acceptable. We mean something very specific around validity, and I have a video linked in the unit where I go through all of these forms. But for now, let's just say validity is a formal property of deductive arguments. And so we wouldn't want to use the term validity with an inductive argument. That's why it's important to identify the two different kinds of arguments in this unit. So it's a formal property of deductive arguments where if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. So I think of validity as this kind of relationship of force. So when we have an argument, we put out the premises and we say if the premises, then the conclusion. So if the premises are true, if we are assuming that they are true, if the premises are true, they force the conclusion to be true by virtue of the form. So another way to put this definition is to say there is no way for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. That is kind of a counterexample. So a counterexample just kind of works like this, where you have something like all dogs are brown, and then you have a white dog, right? It's a counterexample that falsifies a claim, but with an argument, what you have is a kind of counterexample. The form that it takes is the premises being true and the conclusion false. So let's show you what it means, or what it looks like, and you will have gone through this in your readings, for premises to be true where it forces the conclusion to be true. So we have 5 valid forms that we go over in this work. There's more in the world, but these are the big ones that we want to go over. And so when we're looking at modus ponens, and I have it here in this kind of really reduced form, but essentially it is if P then Q, that's premise 1, and then premise 2 asserts P. Okay, so just looking at premise 1 and premise 2, if the premises, then the conclusion. So if we're assuming if P then Q, and we also have P, is it possible to derive not Q? Right, that would be the counterexample. No, Q is forced. Why is Q forced? Because we have P, and then we have if P then Q. So combining premise 1 and 2 give us Q. And so that's necessary. So going back to validity, if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. So modus tollens does something similar. If P then Q, it's the same first premise, but we have not Q. We have not Q, right? And so that's the consequent, right? The second part of this sentence here is the consequent. And if we negate that, we say we don't have Q. No Q. But we know that if we have P, then we must also have Q. But we don't have Q, then we know we don't have P. Okay, so modus tollens, it's really important for you to pay attention to that this is a negation of the consequent, which allows us to derive a negation of the antecedent, the first piece here. We have to always check which direction is the arrow and what is negated. So disjunctive syllogism is slightly different because it's using that exclusive or, which basically says in premise 1 or 2, P or Q, and it takes out one, and so then we affirm the other one, right? And so how could it be, right, go back to validity, would it be possible for P or Q and not Q to be true, and then to also have not P here, not P here? No, right? The combination of these two premises force P to be true. Same here, this forces Q to be true. That's validity. Now, when we get into the hypothetical syllogism, I think of this as a little bit of an if-then domino structure. So if I have two premises, the first one being if P then Q, I have another premise, if Q then R, right? In a certain sense, I can kind of match these up, and this becomes transitive. So then I can derive from the matching up and combining here, if P then R. Now notice how this conclusion has a weird form. The conclusion itself is also an if then. So we don't know if P, we don't know if Q, we don't know if any of them are individually going to happen. But we know that if you have P, you can also, if you have P, then you can derive R. Why? Because if P then Q, if Q then R, allows us to put this if then together. And so you could never have a conclusion here that's sort of not if P then R, right? That would be a counterexample. Constructive dilemma kind of puts it all together. Here we have if P then Q, if R then S, and then we have a third premise, which is disjunct of the a disjunct of these two antecedents, right? And so if we combine and line up these disjuncts, it allows us to derive, well, one of these two consequents. This is derivable. The or of those two is derivable. That's what a constructive dilemma is. Okay, so when we're looking at these relationships, we're looking at how we're looking at a certain kind of necessary relationship. So what is a necessary relationship? Well, I think about the if conditional relationship here. So if the antecedent, then necessarily the consequent, right? If P then Q, or if the premises, then the conclusion. So it's not that the if is necessary, it's that when the if is triggered, what comes after it becomes, what comes after it is necessary. And so we have to watch for that. If validity is a formal property of deductive arguments, we've covered that, where if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true, that is without exception. So that means there is no instance in which the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So what we look at is the fact that valid arguments can have false premises. Why? Because validity is defined as if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. So that allows for, if the premises are true, it allows for they could be false. And we then say, well, why have valid arguments with false premises? Well, it's because validity is a truth-preserving method. It tells us that if the premises are true, the conclusion will also be true. And so it preserves that truthfulness from the premises to the conclusion. But if they're not true, they're, in a way, it's valid, but we're not really getting anywhere with it. So then we have to start talking about another concept, which is soundness. And like validity, it does get used as sort of like, that's a sound argument. But we mean something really specific by it, which is validity, so the formal property, and also the premises are true. So you could have a valid argument, but it turns out the premises are false, right? They're about unicorns or vampires or whatever. So soundness is the formal property is valid, the formal structure is valid, and also the premises are true. So soundness. And so let's take a look at these invalid forms, because that might help us think through validity a little more. So right in the middle here, it says counterexample. Premises are true and the conclusion is false. This is what we really, really, really don't want, is going from T to F. So these valid forms never have a counterexample. The invalid forms always have a counterexample. And so that's part of how we identify their invalid form. So the two that we're going to really cover are affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. And so that's why it's really important to pay attention to what's negated and where. So this is interesting. I actually just found a little boo-boo on here. I'm going to just take this out. This is actually good for everyone to notice and to pay attention. It'll be fixed in the course, but essentially what you have here, is this shouldn't be knotted, but when we're affirming the consequent, right, we're paying attention to the direction of the arrow. And so the arrow says, if P, then Q. So if it's raining, then the streets are wet. Q says, the streets are wet. Can you derive from that it rained? That's P. So is it possible for the streets to be wet, but it didn't rain? Yes. So they're actually, this is an invalid form, because what could have made the streets wet? Well, a fire hydrant, or some kids were playing with a hose, or whatever. But we know that if it rains, then the streets are wet. That's what the first one, that's what the first premise tells us. Then the second premise is Q, which is the consequent. It affirms that consequent, but we need to affirm the antecedent in order to derive the consequent. So that's why that is an invalid form. So denying the antecedent works in a similar way. So if P, then Q, and when it says not P, we're saying, so if it rains, then the streets are wet. It didn't rain, so the streets are not wet. Well, we can come up with another reason why they could be wet, right? But what we know is that it didn't rain, and we know that if it rains, then the streets are wet. But the wetness of the streets has an independence from it, so it allows for a counterexample. And so going over these specifics in the chapter, what I especially recommend going through the exercises for mapping all truth value possibilities, looking at how you can generate a counterexample in order to show that something is not valid.